Welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and on this week's episode, we've brought in someone who, despite not being from North Bay, is incredibly steeped in its history. He was a beloved sports broadcaster, media personality. He spent time on city council. The accolades and the lists of what he has done in our community it goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And even though he's moved away from North Bay in the last few years, he has a couple of big projects that are coming out very soon to commemorate the 100th anniversary of our city. And if you've been listening to a lot of our different podcasts on the Echo Network, you know that we've been talking a lot about North Bay's 100th anniversary next year. In fact, Bill is actually on the City Centennial Celebration Committee. And so we decided to bring on Peter Handley. And I'm sure a lot of you who know North Bay pretty well, a little light bulb probably switched on your head, going, hey, I know who Peter is. So we brought him onto the show. He had some great insight on the differences of history between a place like North Bay that's only 100, coming on to its 100th anniversary, to a place like Kingston where he grew up, which is obviously has a much longer and richer history, and kind of the differences of what it's like to explore those anniversaries and those histories. And he also said a really great line that really stuck with me. He said, sometimes we need to stop looking at the future and take a look behind us at the past. Well, today on the podcast, we have somebody who has had a very storied life. He's worked in media for over 70 years, covering sports, music, news, basically everything. If you're a fan of the North Bay Centennials, you would have heard his vocals. He lent them for 13 years to the Centennials, and he's been a city councilor in North Bay for 9 years. He's written a couple of novels. He has one coming out next year to mark the 100th anniversary of our city. And after all of that, still doesn't look a day over 30. So welcome to the show, Mr. Peter Handley. How are you doing?
Okay. They weren't novels. They were factual books. I haven't got the imagination for a novel.
All right, Bill. So why don't, because you were the one who was really adamant to get Peter in here, especially you're on the committee, correct, for the 100th anniversary. So why don't you tell us why you decided to bring Peter on the show today?
Yeah, well, it is the 100th anniversary in 2025, and that 100 years. And the interesting thing, Peter has been here for a long time, not 100 years, but for a great length of time. We're going to talk a little bit about that because he's seen the city, we'll just say, grow even from amalgamation. And I was just thinking about that as I drove in. I think amalgamation, Peter, was it 67 or 68?
Somewhere in that neighborhood. I'm terrible with dates. Yeah.
But anyway, the purpose of today is to have Peter Handley on because a book is going to be coming out sometime during that centennial, and it will, and that's what we're here to talk about. Various aspects and snippets, and I think it's a good chance for a promo, Peter. And so, Ben, do you want to start off with the first question, or do you want me to?
You go right ahead, because I know you got them in the chamber.
Well, I think the first thing, Peter, is give us a glimpse into why you wanted to do this.
Why? Because number one, to be strictly honest with you. When we moved down here, I knew I had to have a project. I could not just come here and vegetate. And we thought about it before we came down here. We worked on it. We had to do a lot of purging. And I was thinking about it that whole time. And the idea came then because I knew I had to have a project to work on. And the whole thing started basically, if you want to go back, to you used the term intern, a summer student, Keely Ducharme, with the Heritage Committee in the summer 2016, 2017, something like that. She suggested, I was the chair of the Heritage Committee, and in a meeting she said, why don't you do a podcast on heritage? And I said, great stuff. I'd never thought of it. And she came up with the idea, so we did a whole series of podcasts. You were the subject of one of them, and you were also another thought came to my mind while we were doing those heritage podcasts. Okay, why not? I'm a pack rat. And so I had interviews going way, way, way back that I'd recorded, and with Murray Leatherdale and people like that, and Hartley Trussler, and so on and so forth. And I said to myself, why not dig some of those out and use them in the podcast? And that's what we did. And we wound up with something like 60 odd podcasts for the Heritage Committee's podcast series, Diary of Our Shared Past. So I transferred that because if you use a city facility, you have to have a transcription of everything that goes on that podcast for the city. It has to be transcribed into written language. So I said, okay, if that's going to be done, I'm going to have these interviews written. I'm going to need something to do when I come down here to Belleville rather than sit and die, you know? So that's how the book idea started. So when we took those podcasts that transcribed in the city and the museum for the podcast series, and I had started out with about 60 odd, but we've only been able to put something like 44 in the book because of space, and the book is going to be large in pages. And the next step after that was pictures. Some original research on some of the topics that came up, and various pictures. And before I go any further, I've got almost a page of acknowledgments in this book of people who helped the project along. But some people I did not know when I was in North Bay, and others I did know, and I called on them, and they all came back. When I started to think about the idea of pictures, I had contacted Les Cucci about some native Canadian stuff, and he says, "I just bought a camera. So I said, "Great, Les. Have you got any nature stuff or heritage stuff?" He said, "We got a whole group of people." So he contacted these people who are budding photographers. A surprising number of them contacted me. One of them was Bob Burke, who hailed from North Bay. His great-grandfather was the first mayor of North Bay. And Bob provided so much help. Despite having health problems, he was great with the computer. He was able to clean up a lot of pictures. He was able to find a lot of pictures. Mr. Prisco was another magnificent help, getting information and all that sort of stuff. So, and Les provided these various people, including Keith Campbell and people like that, and others that I didn't know, who came and chipped in. And so we've got a lot of great pictures and a lot of interesting transcriptions. And Bill, you mentioned, what did you mention? It wasn't the waterfront. It was another topic you mentioned that we discuss in those interviews a lot of things, including, say, the waterfront, for example. We get the background on the waterfront from Don King and Jean-Jacques Blais, and Blais provided wrote me a separate letter that's in the book, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I'm just maundling on here, Bill. So you throw another question, ask me.
Yeah, well, when you look at the book, are you mainly concentrating on the 100 years? Are you doing a little bit before, like from the evolution of, North Bay became a town, I think it was in 1893. And then, of course, that epic photo of 1925 down at the cenotaph on Ferguson Street. My mother's in that photograph, but that was the day of that when North Bay became a city. So tell us a little bit about the focus of the book and maybe some of the chapters and those kinds of things that you had to sort out, because I know, having written a number of books, that it's a colossal project and you have to try to organize it and get it into kind of biteable chunks. And then there's that that process that no one's likes to do, the editing of paring down the material because we always have too much. So maybe some thoughts about the focus of the book and some of the sections.
It started out really going back to, I mentioned Murray Leatherdale, and I had done an interview with him just before his book came out. And so it starts from there. It goes way back, and he discovered he worked on the he got the Jesuit papers, I believe they're called, and he worked through that. And he was working on the book when I interviewed him, and he goes through a whole lot of stuff about the Aboriginal story and the religious story of North Bay, and starting from there. And we've got other historians. It's in the first chapter. We've got Murray Leatherdale, Cup Gunning, Dr. Bob Surtees, Doug Mackey, Hartley Trussler, and Dr. Françoise Noel. All interviews, some of them going back to 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. So overall, in the 40 some odd interviews we've got in the book, they cover about 50 years from this 1970, the early 1970s to the early 2020s, because some of them were done specifically for the podcast, and therefore they're more focused. Some of the earlier interviews, and looking back on them, if I hadn't known what I know now, what I'm doing now, I would have been more focused on the interview. The interview at the time was done for radio. It was done as a general interest thing, all of them, or television. So they aren't as focused as I'd like them to be, but there's a chapter on that. Then there's the second chapter is 9 chapters altogether. I started out with 12, and it was so much that I had to knock off 3 full chapters and shift a few others into different chapters, if you know what I mean. Bill, you've done this yourself, likely. So there's another chapter on events, major events, the Barry Building explosion. I've got Vic McClenahan's complete story on that. The Dion Quince. There's Natasha Weater, the leader at the Calendar Museum. There's an interview with Pierre Burton, Brian Callahan, and Floyd Endrick, all in connection with the Dions, which was a major thing. Then the Beaumark arrival with Doug Newman. Then the John B. Fraser search with Joe Barrio, both before the boat was found and after. Then there's a foundation one in connection with the lake. Call it the lake, the log, and the livelihood. It's involved with the lake, lumbering, Captain Mac Mason, Wes McNutt, then the railroads. Then there's the Aboriginal part with Morris Switzer. There's interview with Agnes Alon, Grey Owl's daughter, and then an interview with Don Smith in connection with the book on Grey Owl. And then there's a Randy Sawyer interview about traditions. Then there's one on politics with people like Bob Wood, Anthony Rhoda, JJ, Rick Fideli, Jack Burrows, Al McDonald, Don King, George Marousas. There's the outdoor part, and you're involved with that one. There's the Louis de Caroline Lawrence one. Then there's the wartime with Bob Studholme, Sandy O'Grady, Dr. Stephen Connor, and all that. And there's Law and Order with Nestor, Paul Cook, Bob Barton, Mike Burke, so on and so forth. That's the way I've basically broken it down.
That's a lot of work and a lot of editing. And just as you were going down that treasure trove of people and memories and events and so on, you know, we kind of lose track of that daily news. I mean, to this day, we're bombarded with it. And of course, there's less local news now than there was. But when you look at the evolution of any community, you have to look back at all the people and all the events. And of course, North Bay, its geography. You mentioned the lake and how you kind of organize certain things, and I think that's really, really important. When people will look at this, they'll see North Bay's storied history from a whole bunch of different perspectives. And of course, and I was also just thinking, those interviews are priceless. When you think back of, oh wow, no one would have done that unless it was on your podcast. And so those will looking forward, they'll be, as I said, priceless, because those people know the history. They lived the history in many cases.
Yeah, you mentioned what you talked about before was amalgamation. And I couldn't remember what you had mentioned earlier. And amalgamation, Don King talks about that. And that's from the inside. And he didn't call it an amalgamation. He called it, there was a big fight about the time. Was it annexation or was it amalgamation? And Don King goes into all that in the interviews. And there's a whole lot of stuff on the waterfront. And they all give credit to other people for what went on. King talks about the waterfront, and Blair talks about the waterfront, and so on and so forth. And that's the original waterfront breakthrough. And then there was the later waterfront business under Jack Burrows, and so on and so forth. So there's a whole lot of stuff. And the interesting part of it to me was looking back at it is these people in many cases are talking about things that they lived through and they had a hand in. For example, Mac Mason, who captained boats on Lake Nipissing for years and years and years. He talks about the original, what's the name of the boat?
Smith.
The waterfront boat. And my name.
Oh, the Chief Commander. Yes.
Pardon. Chief Commander. I knew I'd have a mind breakdown, but he talks about piloting the original chief and how it rolled. It wasn't a good boat to pilot. Stuff like that is, and Wes McNutt about lumbering and some of his experiences in lumbering around North Bay and all that. And then the railroading and so on and so forth. It's when going through and editing the interviews, it was interesting to hear their points of view and how the railroaders were called into work and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of stuff like that.
I find it, sorry, Bill, I find it really interesting, Peter, what you said about, these people lived it, because it's easy to think about 100 years ago, and that seems like a very long time away. And then you realize that that's like one person's lifespan almost. And so even though it's 100 years, like North Bay isn't even that old. It's very young in terms of generational, if you look at it from a generation standpoint. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, Peter, was because you moved to North Bay, I think you were around 20, I believe, somewhere in that range. You're in your 20s. What does North Bay mean?
25.
25. So what does North Bay mean to you? And why do you have such a passion for the book that you're writing now?
Okay. I grew up in Kingston. And if you want to compare and contrast two communities, they're so completely different. I mean, Kingston is one of the original Canadian towns and cities. You walk down in downtown Kingston, that's all you see is limestone buildings, historic buildings going back to the 18th, 17th, and 18th century. You're surrounded by history. You don't even think about it. North Bay, there isn't any of that. The closest is St. Joseph's Cathedral, if you want to come right down to it. So I didn't even think about all that stuff in all my working years. I was interested for a great many years in sports and sports history. And that's one of the things that I really had a problem with the book, is I had a chapter on sports. I had an interview with Britt Jessup, with Dave Saad, with Pep Kelly. And it came to pairing and cutting. And I couldn't put any of it in. I had to cut all the sports out, which is another reason why I'm working on a second book, which will be 70 or 80% will be sports. Anyway, So I wasn't paying any attention to that sort of thing. But then I got on council, and you look at the city in a completely different way when you're on council and when you're just wandering around covering sports or covering news and this, that, and the other thing. Um, and then some people came. Basically, people came to North Bay and came to the council. This is when you could come to council. You could come to council without making a bloody appointment and being restricted to 4 or 5 minutes, whatever the heck it is. And under Jack, everybody was allowed to speak. Everybody, and it did get out of hand, but because sometimes we'd have 2 hours of presentation, and then we had to go through all the council business for another 2 hours. Anyway, one of the groups that came was a group from Jane Street, the Bill Church, and they said, "We're losing all our heritage buildings. They're going. They're being, in this particular case, it was École Algonquin, was buying up properties to put in an athletic field." So these folks got up in arms, came to council and said, "We got to do something about it." So I was chair of community services, and so we have to look into it. And in our discussions, we said, "Well, why not create a LACAC, which is a local architectural conservation organization?" That what it was called to begin with. And we brought that to council, and I still remember Jack Smiley saying, "You never get it. You never get it. This council will never support that," because a LACAC at the time was really onerous on owners. They had to, if they wanted to make a change on a heritage house, they had to, it was very restrictive and costly. So we decided, how about creating a bastardized LACAC, which is what we did. We didn't designate buildings and houses, we recognized them. Okay, it's a fine difference, but all we had was moral suasion on it. We didn't have any regulations. And so owners would go along with that. Sure, you can look at our house. We don't want to designate it because that means if I want to change an archway in the house, I've got to do it the way it was originally, and I can't afford that. So we created the Heritage Committee, and that's what got me looking at North Bay as other than something that I worried about how the Trappers were doing, or how one of the ball clubs was doing, how the Ticats were doing on the football field. I got to look at it more as a historical entity. And when the LACAC changed, the province decided, well, gee, we're going to change the name of a LACAC to a Heritage Committee. So as soon as I heard that, and the council passed it, I said, my golly, what can we do? We won't just have to look at buildings. We can look at all sorts of other things. So we created the Heritage Site Plaque Program, which was, I know we've got about some 25 odd heritage site plaques scattered around the city. Likely you've seen some of them. And that opened up a whole lot of other things for the Heritage Committee to get involved with. And to me, a Heritage Committee should be involved with all aspects of that sort of stuff, not just buildings. Buildings are part of it, but they're not the complete entity. So that's where I really got interested in it. And as I said, being a pack rat, and I had all these old interviews, why not use them? Because, Bill, as you know, radio is a very evanescent thing. It's here, you're listening at the time. If you hear it, great. But I mean, I'm talking in the 70s, eh? It wasn't even as easy to get a recording at that time. I mean, my golly, when I started back in Kingston in 1955, not 1855, the recording thing was a wire recorder. Bill, I don't even know if you have ever seen a wire recorder. I did a long distance swim using a wire recorder, for crying out loud. And then the tape recorder business was reel to reel, and it weighed about 150 pounds. Plus, you needed another 50 pounds for amplifiers. I did hockey broadcasts, and it just about killed me just carrying the equipment up to the various press boxes. Now you can do it with a little 5-pound box. So I'm very fortunate. I was a pack rat and kept all this stuff. And then you had to worry about, okay, I've got a reel-to-reel tape. Who can give me the reel-to-reel tape in a format that'll allow me to stick it into a computer somehow? And that was Ryan Hain at Nipissing University. He took my reel-to-reel tapes and put them in, and they're available on this bloody computer in front of me. And who would have thought that back in 1970? So, and again, I want to give Ryan a lot of credit, because he spent some of his own time with transferring a lot of these tapes on reel-to-reel, on cassette. I never did 8-track, thank God, and disc, and put them into a stick or whatever you call it, and you can put it into the computer, and there it is.
And what you were doing, Peter, in essence, is, we often talk about oral history, and whether it was for a job or for an intended purpose, it's oral history. The other thing I often tell people, that apart from Indigenous history of thousands of years on the land, the colonial history of Northern Ontario, you mentioned Kingston, North Bay being the first city incorporated, but you look at the 5 cities in Northern Ontario, we haven't been on the land for that long. I mean, they were mining copper along the shores of Lake Superior in the 1800s, and settlers would come in, and actually I'm working on a story on the Mica Bay incident, that which in 1849 right now. But so, and then of course it wasn't until the railways came along that we'll call settlement history started to really take off, and then so it's really, really important to understand that we don't have that long length of history to talk about. And you talked about earlier in buildings, because you're quite right. Other than the Pro Cathedral, the Teachers College that survived the wrecking ball, the courthouse did not, and then of course many of the houses in Main Street West, a lot of the things have disappeared. And so this is what we're left with today. And coming up to the 100th anniversary, we have a lot to celebrate in our own community with regards to this rich heritage that we've had, and again, mostly concentrating on the settlement history from the advent of the railways.
Can I stick something in here, Bill? I'm so happy you're doing your Backroads Bill shtick, and I hope ultimately you will be publishing a lot of those, so that again they're not. And I use the term "just" in quotations, just a newspaper column or something that's, you get them into a more permanent form, and you're investigating stuff that the average Joe has never heard of or even thought about. And I think you're to be given a lot of credit for doing that, because you're saving stuff that, again, another 20, 30, 40, 50 years, all that will likely have changed, and that you will be giving them a picture of something that goes back to 1850 or whatever the heck it goes back to, whatever this topic is. Sometimes it's back thousands and thousands of years, really. And you just alluded, you mentioned the courthouse. And Nestor Prisco tells a story in the book about, North Bay almost wasn't the key to the area. It was just about Mattawa. They had an election and had to have two sections of it before North Bay was being accredited as the head honcho of communities in the area. It could have been Mattawa, only about less than 20 votes. And we talk about Avalanche Al and all that sort of stuff. We almost had the same thing way back.
It's funny that you mentioned Nestor Prisco, because by the time that this podcast comes out, we actually just talked to him on the Echo Essentials podcast about his book that just came out. But Bill, I wanted to ask you too, because I asked Peter this, but what does North Bay mean to you as somebody who you talked about Northern Ontario in a large scale, and on the show we do everything on Northern Ontario, but if we're talking specifically about North Bay, and this is the place where this is your home base. What does North Bay mean for you?
Yeah, because I was born and raised here, and I grew up in the joke shop. And when I say the joke shop, my father and mother started that at the end of the Second World War. I grew up on Main Street in the joke shop and in the Melrose, and everyone, it was the Melrose Theater, and that's how my father got the name, but everyone just knew it as the joke shop and a place to go, all the stuff that no one should lay eyes on, so to speak, and that's the environment I grew up in. But so North Bay, and I want to key in on the lake because we lived on the lake and water and of course the hills and skiing. And so it became a playground. And I think when I think what it means to me, it was probably our environment, our geography probably promoted me going outside and loving to be outside. And of course, that's been my life, being outside with nature. So North Bay was the perfect spot. If I would have been perhaps raised in downtown Toronto or another urban center, it may not have been the same. So North Bay was that gateway to the north as well, because exploring the rest of Northern Ontario, even though it's we'll call it the southern gateway or terminus, it became very, very important. I often laugh about Ed Diebel and Merle Dickerson. I mean, Ed Diebel was not so wrong about having Northern Ontario as its own province. And so I always look at Northern Ontario with a small n, because it's not a proper noun, is that it could have been a province. And so this is where I have lived my life. And I'm glad to say that.
And Peter, as we start to wrap up, what, for people who are reading your book, what do you hope that people get out of it?
Sort of an idea that North Bay is people today are inclined to think of today and tomorrow rather than yesterday. Not North Bay's yesterday doesn't go back as far as Kingston's yesterday, but it's still there, and it's the foundation of what is going on today. You go back, I did a thing in one of the books I did for the North Bay Sports Hall of Fame called Flashbacks, and one of the stories was about the Memorial Gardens, the whole Memorial Gardens thing, and the fight over the gardens, and even artificial ice. I mean, we didn't get artificial ice till 1948. And that sounds like a long time ago, but really, a lot of communities down south had it years and years and years before that. And we're going through the same sort of a hassle today with whatever happens to that ice palace or whatever George Marousas used to call it, that's supposed to go up ultimately somewhere around O'Michelle Field. Things change, but things are the same. I mean, we've been fighting about Main Street and keeping Main Street alive for years and years and years. And it's still going to be a fight, and they're still fighting about it. Are they ever going to turn Oak Street into one way and Main Street is two ways, and so on and so forth, and all the buildings downtown and homeless and so on and so forth. All that's new stuff, but it's old stuff too. I mean, some of the characters that you read about in the 25-year anniversary booklet, which is just a marvelous booklet that was put out by the city when we are the 25th anniversary book, tells about city characters. And those people were the homeless of the day. There weren't as many of them, of course, because the population wasn't nearly as high. But what is it? There's an expression: the more things change, the more they stay the same. There's a Chacun song, whatever. I will screw up the translation, but you know what I'm getting at. So I've wandered off the track, which is not surprising, because I'm not directing this. I'm just allowed.
Well, you were talking about the characters.
I'm used to directing.
Yeah, North Bay's had many characters. I was just thinking about the badge man, who when I was
Yes.
growing up,
Yes.
the Badgeman was a mainstay on Main Street, and of course, thinking back about him, many characters.
Colin Vesna talks about that in one of the interviews I do with him. It's in the book, quite a little bit about this gentleman. So I don't know. I just wanted to do this. I hope it's going to be a useful reference point for people that want to go back and say, well, what really was the story about the waterfront? What really was the story about the amalgamation? What really was the story about this, that, and the other thing? And a lot of it's covered in the various interviews. What really happened to the Barry Building explosion? How big was that? I mean, people today, what was the Barry Building explosion? But I'll tell you, when we put that heritage site plaque up for the Barry Building explosion, we got some survivors and some family members out, and we had the police, and their police were there, and the fire department, but and all that. It was really quite a scene, and a lot of people never. Well, what's the Barry Building explosion then? I mean, and the golf club explosion is another one. Bud Berry tells a story about that. That's just a marvelous story about one of the Air Force folks who lived on the up in that area near the golf club. He had a little girl, and she used to sleep in a little outhouse because she liked sleeping outside. And this one day, the parents said, "Come on, you're sleeping inside tonight." And the golf club explosion occurred, and a huge rock tore through that little building and right where that child would have been sleeping. Just such little things remind you how fragile sometimes and how quixotic life can be. And your writings, Bill, I'd love for you to, I mean, you're a place guy, right? You're a place and thing guy. A lot of these interviews are people interviews. I'd love to see you do some people stuff in all of, I mean, because with you be talking to people who know some of these, we use the term characters. Some of these people, Soapy Smith type people, you know? I'd love for you to do something like that. Sorry, but
no, sage advice, that's for sure. And that's one of the reasons, the joy of having the Backroads Bill podcast with Ben, is that we are talking to people every week, and that's a kind of a different thing for me to do, but it's lovely, because what happens is we tease out all kinds of information that is probably never written down, and that's the power of oral history, I would say, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. As we wrap up, anything we did not cover that you guys like to say before we go offline?
Well, I'm glad to have Peter on right at this moment, and looking forward to the book and the books, because there's going to be the sports book after the fact, and the 25th anniversary is coming up in X number of months, and there's going to be celebrations and events.
100th, not the 25th, Bill.
No,
100.
Did I say 25?
About 75 on top of that.
Yeah, 75 on that. The 100th anniversary is coming up in 2025, and so we'll look forward to that. And I think the book will be a good cornerstone for people to look back at the 100 years and really understand the joy of the place that we live in.
It's called Vis-a-Vis, North Bay in Deed and Tale. And the second one will be Vis-a-Vis 2, North Bay Sports and then some. At the Vis-a-Vis, it was my son's idea, actually. He said, call it Head to Head, and because they're based on transcriptions of interviews for the most part, although I did some original research. And the second book, a lot of original research on various North Bay sports, basketball, hockey, and I hope to do one on football. But Vis-a-Vis originally, Latin through French, means head to head. Its meaning has changed changed over the years, but the original meaning was head to head. So that's what it's called. And it's 40 some odd interviews with 49 people or whatever the heck it is. I don't know.
When are you expecting for it to come out, Peter?
Working on other stuff. Well, that's a long, involved story. I was hoping to have it come out this spring, but it'll likely be closer to the fall
of this year.
I'm hoping all the idea is that the books will be given to the North Bay Museum and the Calendar Museum to put on sale, and any money they get out of those sales will go to the two museums. This is it's a vanity thing for me, to a sense. I wanted to have some of the stuff and the people that I talked to put in a more concrete form than they have been originally. Because, as I said, if you don't listen, if you're not watching Kojiko at the time of an interview or listening to radio at the time, you don't get it. You don't see it or hear it. And so I'm trying to get some help on the publishing side of it, but any remuneration from the books will go to the two museums. That's my idea anyway. And I hope it comes, the first one, hopefully out in the fall sometime.
Perfect.
And it, just to give it a last plug, it's a unique way of looking at history. It's through the people who researched and the people who talked about and the people who lived through certain aspects of North Bay's history. It's not, and I have every respect for Cup Gunning and Hartley and people like that. A lot of it was taken out of newspapers, stories at the time. These are actual personal stories and individuals who giving their own slant on different things. Anyway, I've talked way too much.
No, we can be here.
Thank you for giving me this. I really appreciate it for both of you gentlemen for allowing me to come on and talk on.
Anytime. And I'm sure coming into the 25th, see, now I'm saying the 25th anniversary because of Bill, the 100th anniversary. I'm sure if you're up to it, Peter, we would probably get you on a couple of other podcasts as well to talk about some other stuff.
Love to do it.
Awesome.
Love to do it.
Thank you so much once again for taking the time out of your morning.
My pleasure.
Well, a big thank you to Peter for joining us. I'm very excited to see how his book will shape up, and I know he will be back at some point on the Echo Network on some show somewhere around the line over the next calendar year as we start ramping up for the centennial anniversary. And of course, if you enjoyed today's episode, you can always find more episodes wherever you find your favorite podcasts, as well as on our website, NorthBayEcho.ca. New episodes come out every single Wednesday. And while you're over there on NorthBayEcho.ca, you can check out all of our other great podcasts, including Echo Essentials, where tomorrow at 2 p.m., when it drops, we talk to a local man who is unable to sell his eggs anymore because the amount of PFAS that was found in the water, and he lives just up on Tower Drive. Now, obviously, the PFAS and the water in Trout Lake and all this stuff, very hot topic right now. In fact, there was a story about it that made its way onto CBC. So very hot topics. We have a very interesting conversation. Scott and Dave have a very good conversation with that gentleman. You can catch that tomorrow on all of your favorite podcast players and over on NorthBayEcho.ca. It drops roughly around 2 p.m. in the afternoon. And we are all out of time this week, but don't forget to come back next Wednesday for yet another Backroads Bill adventure.